It is November 25th, 2025. And just when you think that these proposals for a possible settlement for the war in Ukraine, really for a possible ceasefire to get Russia trapped into, just when you think that they could not get any more ridiculous, they always find a way, as we now have reports of this 19-point plan that Kiev has concocted that would be a non starter for Russia on just about every level. Kiev says that they've agreed to a plan with the US. Now we have all of these reports of different talks going on and a number of questions that remain about where this is headed. Has the Trump administration finally seen the writing on the wall and figured out that they need to get out of this one before the Kiev regime crumbles, or are they going to try to keep kicking the can down the road as Russia keeps advancing on the battlefield? And what does that situation on the battlefield look like right now? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that the mainstream media headlines are buzzing with the claim that Zelensky has agreed to a deal to end the war in Ukraine. But we don't really know what that deal is. We've had a 28-point version from the US that was leaked to the media, a 28-point revision by the EU that is somehow even more ridiculous. And now there are reports of a 19-point version from Kiev, which would give them a chance to still fight for territory in the Donbass that Russia controls and that is part of the Russian Federation. So basically a non-starter. How do you view the current back and forth that seems to be getting more unrealistic by the day?
Yeah, it's a circle jerk. Literally, all of this is moot because Russia wouldn't have agreed to the original 28-point version, at least any version of it we've seen, because there was one put out by Axios and there was another one linked on Telegram by a Kiev regime Rada member, Goncharenko, which was substantially different on several points from the one on Axios, and now we have the EU putting out their 26-point let's sink Trump's plan. It already had no chance of happening, but let's double down on that. And now, just yesterday, the news came out. The U.S. and representatives from the U.S. and the Kiev regime were negotiating in Geneva. At least some of this, we don't know everyone who was there, but we know on the Kiev regime side, their delegation was led by two of the biggest figures implicated in the corruption scandal, right? The Grey Cardinal Chief of Staff Yermak and the former defense chief, still technically chair of the Security Council, Rustem Umarov. And they were two of the biggest people figured on this corruption scandal by Naboo, this obvious pressure lever being activated by Washington. And then it was like, give them the green light, and then, all right, now give them the yellow, the flashing yellow. We're on flashing yellow now. So everyone forgets the corruption scandal. And on the U.S. side, I believe that the new Kellogg was there because Kellogg has evidently been replaced. And the new Kellogg is the U.S. Army Secretary Driscoll. I believe Dan Driscoll. He is interesting figure. He does have some prior military service. I think his biggest qualification is that he went after his service in the military to Yale Law School with J.D. Vance. And they were classmates and friends, evidently. And Driscoll's biggest advantage is whether they kind of go together because he's not seen as a Washington blob insider. He tried to run for Congress once and failed, and then was basically picked up by Vance and Trump campaign. And so he is a Trump Vance political loyalist. He owes everything to them. He doesn't have a wider political connections or success in politics in the U.S. And secondly, because he's not generally part of the blob. I believe a lot like Witkoff, he probably doesn't have the same level of foreign policy baggage, exceptionalist baggage, that type of mentality of the pursuit of U.S.-led Western global hegemony against Russia and China at all costs, blah blah blah. So I mean, I think that's intrinsic. He did serve in the army and so forth, but I think he has it probably to a lesser degree. So he has obviously been selected as the new peace envoy to Ukraine because he's seen as a loyalist and without other, um, shall we say, qualifying factors with other people's have their hooks in him in Washington. Now, he originally went to Kiev to give Zelensky the Riot Act. And just a few days ago, it already seems a world away, Zelensky was supposed to sign on the dotted line. It was an ultimatum, right? He had to sign it. He had to sign it by Thanksgiving. And Driscoll showed up in Kiev and said something along the lines of, this feces has got to stop. I mean, those were the words quoted, from him in the Western media. He was very blunt, and evidently he was so blunt and straightforward that then the White House had to walk back and say that he had basically exceeded his designated powers in pressuring Zelensky. That was I guess the Europeans were extremely upset and cried about it. So he has been dialed down since then. But in Geneva, the U.S. and the Kiev regime were basically renegotiating all of this. And suddenly the Thanksgiving deadline has gone away. The Trump 28-point plan, again, already unacceptable to Russia, but let's put that to the side for now. That Zelensky was just supposed to accept and sign. That's out the window. First, it was going to be there are going to be changes. But by the end of yesterday, by the end of Monday, the Zelensky in Ukrainian, not in English, but in Ukrainian, Zelensky's office was tweeting out that Trump's 28-point plan was dead. It was, to quote, extinct, i.e., they had killed it. They were claiming victory over Trump. Of course, they were careful not to do it in English, but it was pretty stark, the terms that they were talking about. They were talking about it like they were St. George slaying the Trump dragon, or along those lines. And we know the Europeans had their input. They had their own counter proposal, right? A poison pill that was supposed to, sink the whole thing. That was no peace plan whatsoever. It was literally a plan for maintaining the war for, forever, essentially. And we don't know how much input. We don't know when they went. The Europeans were evidently in Geneva too, but they didn't have direct FaceTime that we know of with the Americans. It was more like they were consulting the Ukrainians, and then the Ukrainians. And when Rubio was asked about the European plan, he was like, I haven't even seen that. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, of course he knew about it, right? He was literally saying the Europeans don't matter and just ignoring them whatsoever. So, but it appears that Zelensky, that the Ukrainians, despite what you would think is all of this pressure, the military, the pressure that the Kiev regime is feeling on the battlefield, the pressure of these corruption scandals, which it seems fairly obvious now that the U.S. turned on with a green light to pressure Zelensky specifically in all of this. The threat to withhold military and intelligence from the Kiev regime, military aid and intelligence. Okay, yeah, that one doesn't have much truth because they promised to do that before and they never actually followed through on it. So, but anyway, you would think that they would have leverage, but it appears the exact opposite. Now, we don't know what the final plan is. And we also know where there are still points of contention. And those are actually on the big things: joining NATO and territorial concessions. And that was definitively put out as two of the major issues that are supposed to then be resolved with Zelensky and Trump when they meet personally later this week, possibly, right? Like I said, all of this is moot. This is the U.S. and the Kiev regime in Europe still arguing about three different plans, none of which the Russians would accept, and the Russians just continue on the battlefield. Now, of course, Putin has put it in diplomatic terms, right? Because he's still playing this game of giving a respectful nod of deference to Trump. Let me phrase it in those terms, right? Or you could say that he's still blowing smoke up Trump's rear end, like most other countries in the world, other than China, evidently are doing. But he said that they did not refer to Trump's peace plan. They referred to the understanding that supposedly he reached with Trump back in Alaska, which is, I guess, supposed to be the inspiration for Trump's 28-point plan, and that Trump then walked away from and has now come back to out of desperation because the Kiev regime is, collapsing, or at least crumbling all along the front line: Pokrovsk, Kupyansk, Lyman, Konstantinovka, Guliaipole, everywhere, Siversk. I guess that is the reason why he's come back to this. But of course, it still doesn't come anywhere close. And it's also the terms it's framed in, because it is framed, at least in the media, as an ultimatum to Russia that you have to sign. Well, we see already that Ukraine didn't accept that ultimatum, and Trump supposedly would have much more leverage over the Kiev regime than he does over Putin, right? In fact, I would say that he has next to no leverage over Russia. But Putin still says it could be the basis for actual negotiations, which actually haven't begun. Except that we found out the negotiations did begin between Russia and the U.S. secret. I don't know how secret you can be when you announce it to the press, but they did announce it to the press later in the day. But evidently, Driscoll is now in Abu Dhabi, and he is meeting with the. It's not clear who he's meeting with from the Russian side, but he's meeting with someone from the Russian side. So the Trump administration does seem to be doing two tracks of negotiation at the same time. Now, does the right hand know what the left hand is saying and talking to each other? I'm doubtful about any of that, particularly with the Trump administration. But there are negotiations going on. But at the end of the day, Russia is still what Russia is ultimately going to do. There's no way they're going to accept any of this, right? They're never going to accept NATO member state troops in Ukraine. They're never going to accept a 600,000 capped Ukrainian military, which is probably twice as big as the actual Ukrainian military right now. And a whole host. I mean, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The Telegraph version, they had Russia was supposed to lease Donbass from Ukraine. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff is out there, none of which is acceptable to Russia in the slightest. But Russia is going to do what they have done, from the beginning of the Trump administration. They will signal their willingness to diplomacy, but as Putin said, if we don't get what we want diplomatically, then we're happy meeting the goals of the SMO on the ground. He said that outright in the last few days. And that obviously is meant to tell the Trump people outright, you either agree to what we want or we continue. We're not going to agree to your little ceasefire ultimatum, even if we talk nicely about it. But they will try to drag it out. They will say they will never outright refuse it, because that's not the way Russians do diplomacy. They will say, well, here is a few points that we actually do agree on, and we can start talks, right? We can start serious negotiations on the basis of that. That's not the way the Trump administration, they are not capable of the level of patience, and they have a type of, shall we say, foreign policy attention deficit disorder. They can't stay focused on anything for any amount of time. They think that diplomacy, between great powers, is something that is done in a smoky room with a handshake, and then it's done. And that's that's Trump's art of the deal, right? The way he did business deals, and he thinks that's the way that foreign policy among great powers works. I mean, that might work with small Western aligned countries that come begging to Trump to lift the crushing tariffs from them, and kowtow to him and everything. But that's simply not going to work with Russia. Russia will go through the dance. They will engage in diplomatic action, and they will try to drag it out for months and months until they're entirely new realities on the ground in Ukraine. And maybe by that time, the West will be forced to admit the realities that are on the ground now. Of course, they won't be caught up to the realities then, because there's always at least a half a year lag between them recognizing reality on the battlefield, it seems. But we'll be going through something probably very similar to this another 3 or 6 months down the line again. And then rinse and repeat.
Yeah, it just feels like it never ends, but I'm with you. It's interesting to watch, especially with Putin's response to it, right? Because he is very diplomatic. He's like, sure, let's use whatever you came up with that wasn't what we agreed on as the basis of a deal. We'll take a few points from that. But then he also pointed to the situation in Kupyansk, and he's like, hey, remember when the Ukrainians said that there were only a handful of Russian soldiers that got into this city while we were actually fully surrounding and controlling this city? Yeah, look at how that turned out for you. That's just going to happen over and over again. And so,
hey, did you miss? They suddenly announced today that they took Pokrovsk back, and they're going to be marching on Moscow next week.
well, speaking of, I did want to get into the situation on the battlefield, and I was looking into it, and I see this Washington Post article that stood out to me that I want to get your response on, because
Oh my
it
God.
has the headline, Russia's tiny advances in 2025 sold Putin on Moscow's inevitable victory. And they claim that Russia hasn't accomplished much this year. They will not acknowledge that it has taken Pokrovsk. They do, though, then go in the article to admit that, quote, although for years Russia's advance has been slow, wars are unpredictable, and analysts note that the situation could swiftly change if
That was the
Russia
one honest sentence in the whole thing.
They say if Russia manages to exploit Ukraine's visible exhaustion and mounting problems with troop levels in 2026. So they give you all the propaganda, and then they finally get into a little bit of honesty for at least a sentence there. Because obviously, as you have been saying and noting for years, this is not a war for territory. This is a war of attrition. So what is your response to an article like that, and how do you see the situation on the battlefield?
Okay, this is pure propaganda and copium at a professional Jeff Bezos level, a bit of disinformation out there. The still, they go to the standby. Yes, Russia has done this, however grudgingly, but at what cost, right? At what cost? And they keep talking about these massive casualties that Russia has suffered, which is, still the absolute basis of all Western propaganda, which isn't, to say that Russia hasn't suffered casualties. And it's important when they talk about casualties to try to pin them down between the difference between KIA and wounded, because according to the Russians, almost 90% of their wounded, right, are relatively light and return to their units within a few weeks or a few months at most, right? And that there's soldiers who have been injured 6, 7, 8, 10 times, right, and are still going. So first of all, they try to inflate numbers together by, they've suffered 200,000 casualties in the last year, or, something of the sort. And then, it turns out, well, maybe the KIA is only like 20 to 30,000 and the rest are wounded, and 80% of those wounded are back at their stations already. That's the kind of sleight of hand that they do when they talk about this. So, of course, the one thing they will never talk about is the Kiev regime's casualties, because according to the same people they're getting their information from, right, Ukraine has only ever suffered something like 41,000 dead in this entire conflict, right, which is absolutely absurd. So rest assured that Russia's casualties are they exist, but they are much smaller than the Western media tries to make them out to be. And that is their whole justification. Because if it was ever admitted, the lopsided ratio on between, when we're talking KIA between Russia and the Kiev regime forces, it would, just on moral terms, it would be very hard to continue the flow of arms, continue funding what is, something quite brutal and quite merciless, and something that the Kiev regime is all too willing to feed their own massively, forcibly conscripted people into. They also never put the dots together, and the fact that the Kiev regime has some 400,000 deserters at this point, according to their official numbers, which is larger than the armies of the UK, France, and Germany put together. To put that in perspective, they never talk about the hundreds of thousands of Europeans that have fled to Europe, and they're still trying to figure out how to force them back to fight and die for their proxy regime. That the fact that the number of Ukrainians who want to fight and die for this regime is very small now. Most of those ideologicals, most of them are dead now, right? To a very significant degree. And the process by which new young ones along the same ideological means are generated is fairly low at this point, right? We saw that when Zelensky opened up the border suddenly a few months ago from for young men between the ages of 20 and 22, below the draft age of 25, which is where it's still at, only because of very narrowing demographic terms on those numbers. But there was suddenly a huge flood of hundreds of thousands of more young Ukrainian men into Europe, and the Germans have been complaining about it. Don't let them into our country. Conscript them, make them fight for you, right? That they're outright saying that. But that logic is never played together. In fact, in that same Washington Post article, they conclude by how Ukrainians are all united and they're all fiercely resisting and everything. And I'm like, well, what about those 400,000 deserters? Right. There's hundreds of thousands of people fled to Europe, and all those elite whom their own children are off in Europe, in private schools and ski lodges and whatnot. So where is this, fierce resistance that you're talking about? I guess they're referring to the mass forcibly conscripted, people press ganged off the streets of Ukrainian cities at this point, and days off, right? Because that's cementing the Kiev regime forces along the front lines, often operating as blocking units where they make sure that you're not allowed to retreat or surrender or anything of that sort. So, but there's so many holes and contradictions in their own narrative of what's going on that, they never acknowledge that Zelensky told them about, Pokrovsk and Kupyansk, and that the Ukrainians had driven them out and there were only 60 Russians left in the city. And you're right, they still tried to pretend like Pokrovsk isn't completely in Russian hands at this point.
Yeah, it's bizarre to watch it, but at the same time, like you're saying there, they find ways to claim that, oh, this is our evidence, they don't ever really have to actually show you any kind of evidence, or they don't ever have to say, well, this is what the situation really looks like, because it's just their endless stream of propaganda. Now, the last thing I wanted to get into is really just the overall state of this war when it comes to the growing advantages that Russia has versus the growing disadvantages that we're seeing on Kiev's side, because not only can Kiev not keep up with Russia's manpower, but all of NATO cannot keep up with Russia's weapons production. So they can, the remaining Ukrainians can quote unquote resist all they want and rally together all they want. But as the head of Russia's state-owned defense conglomerate, Rostec, described it, quote, "We are supplying aircraft, tanks, infantry vehicles, howitzers, electronic warfare systems, drones, and much more in enormous quantities. No country in the world today produces as many shells and aerial bombs. I can't give specific figures, of course, so I will put it this way. Our adversaries could not have dreamed of such volumes." Now, time has always been on Russia's side here, but how do you view the growing disadvantages for Kiev, and what does that tell us about where this conflict is headed, no matter what the mainstream media in the US has to say?
Yeah, you actually don't have to take the words of the CEO of Rostec on this, because this has actually all been admitted by Western officials and the Western media at one point or another. And then, of course, it's not allowed to stick in the narrative. Like, it's admitted and then it's just dropped away into the sinkhole. But the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and the previous one, have repeatedly said that Russia is outproducing all of NATO put together in terms of artillery shells by 3 times, 4 times, right? I mean, that's already been out. We had the German defense minister Boris Pistorius last year admitting that Russia is producing, in terms of not just artillery shells, other types of ammunitions, missiles, but also vehicles, armored vehicles and tanks and artillery pieces, that they were producing far more than they needed or were using for the special military operation, and were stockpiling it. Right? That was admitted by the German defense minister. Again, these things are admitted, but they're not allowed to penetrate the daily narrative, right? They're dropped through the fact holes at this point. So all of this is known. It has been admitted for a long time that Russia has not only a quantitative advantage in drones by 3 to 6 times at this point, but also a qualitative, right? Particularly when we're talking about things like fiber optic drones and long range strike drones and the like. Once again, that's dropped out of the not only out of the memory, but also out of the assessment. Because when you're doing a casualty assessment and you realize that Russia has an advantage in long range artillery, air dominance with glide bombs, long range strike drones, FPV drones advantage, fiber optics, everything. You add it all up, and you're like, and then you're going to tell us these casualty numbers? I mean, oh yes, because the Russians, despite all these advantages, are then just not using that and just throwing all their troops in massive meat wave attacks and all being gunned down, and each brave Kiev regime neo-Nazi is mowing down 100 or 200 Russians a person, but finally dragged down just by the weight of the bodies of all those he's killed, right? I mean, that's the kind of ridiculous propaganda. But the main advantage of all of this, and we're seeing it right now, right? This is a war of attrition, and the butcher's bill for the war of attrition is coming due. And we're seeing it with this crumbling all along. It's not just Pokrovsk and Kupyansk. It's Siversk, it's Lyman, it's Konstantinovka, Guliaipole. Russian forces, they just shot up there. I'm amazed at that speed. Frankly, they've encircled some 60% and are already engaging in street battles in Guliaipole in the eastern Zaporozhye direction out of nowhere. I mean, they're in that direction in the south, in Zaporozhye. They're taking several settlements a day at this point because they're continuing to flank wide around Guliaipole, even as they're engaging from one direction. Just so many crumbling defenses along the line, and all of this, the Kiev regime military is getting smaller and they're getting weaker, and we have European defense analysis by the Kiel Institute and others who are tracking such things that says the amount of military aid to Ukraine is significantly going down, that it is on a long-term downward trend, not only because the Trump administration doesn't want to play ball to the same extent anymore, but simply because Western inventories are out, right? And they're down to production by month that they're able to get to the Kiev regime. So all of this is slowly accumulating, and it results is that Russia is advancing faster and faster everywhere. And it's not about territory. It's about destroying the Ukrainian military. And at this point, most of the territory is almost by default, right? They have to move forward to continue engaging the Kiev regime forces. And eventually they're going to have to, it's like everything else, right? If you look back at their propaganda back in Mariupol and Bakhmut and Avdiivka and everything, look at their propaganda then and see how wrong they were about everything and how right we were about everything. And, it's the same thing today, except that everything is happening now all along the contact line in multiple big locations all at once, and it's all happening much faster. And that acceleration is only going to increase, which is why the U.S., at least the Trump administration, at least Trump and Witkoff, right, and maybe J.D. Vance, are so desperate because they're afraid that the Kiev regime in the near future could, the big C word, collapse, right? I'm not saying we're at collapse yet. I don't like that word. I'll stick with crumbling, right? I'll stick with crumbling. But they are obviously afraid that collapse is a possibility, right? Not just the military, but the economic, because the Kiev regime runs out of money in a few months, and the Europeans, without stealing Russia's money, can't afford to continue to fund it. And now you've got this political crisis that the Trump administration turned on in Kiev, which is just compounding everything. Political crisis, economic crisis, military catastrophe on the battlefield. Don't want to say perfect storm because that's a cliche, but it's a hell of a storm.
It is, and it's fascinating to watch, as exactly as you're noting there. You're looking at the Trump administration and going, okay, what are you guys actually going to do here?
Why?
Are you going to do everything in your power to trap Russia in a deal? From the points we've seen, it doesn't feel like it, but that's not to say that they couldn't come up with some quote-unquote perfect version to try to sell to Russia. But if nothing else, it gives us a lot to continue to cover, because there is certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Y'all be sure to check out his work at boosty.to/therealpolitik. Mark, thanks so much for your time and insight.
See y'all later.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And Jax has popped up here to say hi really quick, and also to remind y'all that if you want to support my work, you can check out my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction. You can also find Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/RachelBlevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and we hope you have a good day.